All right, what we have here is we're going to go through the graphs of sine and cosine. Well, first off, let's look at the sine function. And when you talk about the sine function right here, here is a sine curve. Whenever you're doing any type of graphs, it's good to identify some key points. And so these key points that I'm going to identify right here are the start of the cycle of the sine curve. And they come from the unit circle. All right, if you remember the unit circle, woo! All right, the unit circle has a each point is a radius of 1, and so we have these different points. We have like 1, 0, at 0. At pi over 2 or 90 degrees, we have 0 and 1. All right, we have another point right here at pi, which is going to be negative 1 and 0. And then at 3 pi over 2, we have another point of 0 and negative 1. Now, sine is y, all right, because when you use the unit circle, we're looking at the y values. So right here, we're going to be plotting at each one of these points these y values. And actually, that is what allows us to find our different points, because the input of a sine function is angles, and the output are ratios from the unit circle. Okay, so with this, what we have is we're going to start at 0 degrees, all right, 0 degrees. So when we have this right here, this is referring to the angles x and the ratios y. And so when we plot this, we're going to start at 0, 0. Then at pi over 2, which is 9 degrees, we know we have 1. And then we go over here at pi, which is going to be 0 again, because that's the y. And then over here, we have 3 pi over 2. We have negative 1. Let me see that right there. And then we go all the way to 2 pi. 2 pi is located, located right there. All right, and what we can see, 2 pi right there. And what we can see then is at this point right there, we create this nice little sine curve. And this sine curve is what we call periodic. Periodic. It's called periodic because it repeats. All right, just like a circle, it goes around and around and around, or it could go around in the other direction. All right, and around in the other direction and around the other direction as many times as you want, because they are coterminal angles. And so that's why you see when you go in that negative direction, negative pi over 2, that this will repeat and will go and you find a periodic function. Now, the question is, what is the period? Now, a period is the time or length of the repetition. Okay, and so here we can see that what does it take to go around a whole entire circle? Well, from 0 to 2 pi is the period, all right, the time it takes for the sine to repeat. Okay, the amplitude refers to what you see is that since it repeats, we say it oscillates, goes up and down right here. All right, going up and down like this, and it oscillates along what we call a midline. Okay, a midline. All right, or the line of oscillation. And this is the imaginary line, and when you have a basic sine function, it is the y equaling 0 axis. Okay, so what we know then is that we have a sine function, which is periodic. It repeats every 2 pi. We have a amplitude. Now, the amplitude is this other cool word, and that is talks about the height, all right, or kind of like the amplitude, the length, all right, of the peak and valley from the line of oscillation. So amplitude actually we refer to as the distance, all right, is the distance from the midline, or line of oscillation to the max or the min, okay, in the graph. And so right here, we can see that what is the distance? Well, the distance we would say is the absolute value of our amplitude A, and in this case, it would equal 1. Down here, we can see that it's the same value because if I go from here to the valley right there, we can see that we have a amplitude of 1 again, because that is a distance. And I have absolute value because it refers to the distance. Okay, the distance of, all right, the length from the midline to the max, or the midline to the min, all right, the peak or the valley, sometimes we refer to it. All right, so in this case, a sine has an amplitude of 1. Well, we look at here, and we have the range. The range is referring to the outputs, okay, all outputs. And what we look for all outputs, well, just like the sine cosine, what's the highest value the y can get is 1, and the lowest value is -1. So we see a range of values goes from -1 to 1. And the domain is the inputs. And what angles and the inputs of sine are angles. What angles can you plug in? Well, we would say all real numbers. There's any angle I can plug in there. Sometimes we can write it as negative infinity to infinity and beyond. And that's what we got there. All right, so we have a domain of sine, which is all real numbers, a range from -1 to 1, and then a period of 2 pi and an amplitude of 1. Cosine is literally almost the same thing, except it has different values because obviously you plug those differently from into the unit circle. Because when you look at cosine in the unit circle is referring to the x values in this unit circle. So if you have this unit circle right here, we can see that the x value right there is 1. This one is 0, -1, and 1 for the x values that we're looking for. Not this x value, but the x and our points on our unit circle. So when we have this, we plug in our value here at 0, and we realize we have a value of 1. Plug a value at pi over 2, we realize the value is 0. We plug the value at pi, we can see that our point right there, we have -1, 0, and so that's going to be -1 there. 3 pi over 2, or 270 degrees, that's going to be 0 again. Boom. Oops, that's 0. All right. And then we go over here at 2 pi. When we go a full time around the circle, we have a value of 1. And you can see the sine, or says this cosine function is also periodic. It has the same midline as a sine function, except it appears that it's maybe shifted over, all right, to the left, all right, pi over 2 units, okay, pi over 2 units, so 90 degrees. It shifted to the left 90 degrees. Well, that's interesting. That's what cosine is. We'll talk more about those transformations in another video. But, so what do you see is the domain. So what are the inputs? Well, once again, the inputs are still angles. Okay, so we still have angles here, and it's all real numbers. That's awesome. All right, and what else do we got? The range. Well, how high and how low it goes? Well, just like the sine function, it goes from -1 to 1. The period, how long does it take to repeat? Well, you can see that because it goes one time around the unit circle, the period, just like sine, is pi, or 2 pi. The amplitude, just like sine, what is the distance from the midline to the peak, or the max, or the min? And we realize that amplitude is also equal to 1. So the amplitude is 1 for our sine and cosine function. All right, so those are the two basic functions. And the things you should know are these 5 key points of 0, pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi to create one full period, all right, one full period of the sine and cosine function. Sine at 0 is 0, and at cosine, it starts at 1. Then every pi over 2, you go from 0, and it just repeats -1, 0, 1, 0, and so on and so forth, depending on what the function is. All right, well, we're in the next video, we're going to talk more about the period and amplitude. So I hope this helps you out, a little bit of introduction to sine and cosine functions.